The granite remembered summer long after summer had forgotten itself. Marin Calloway pressed her palm flat against the face of Widow's Ridge at 6 in the morning when the air still carried the bite of mountain nights and the sky had barely decided on its color. The stone was cold. She held her hand there anyway, feeling the chill move up through her fingers and settle in her wrist like something with intention. She had been coming here every morning for 6 weeks. Not to mourn the view, not to find God in the landscape the way Reverend Aldous encouraged his congregation to do on Sunday mornings. She came to measure. She came because the rock held information that no one else in Harlan Flats seemed interested in reading. By 9 o'clock, the granite had shifted. Not warm, but less hostile, the cold retreating by degrees, the stone beginning its slow negotiation with the climbing sun. By 3 in the afternoon, she could not hold her hand there for more than 30 seconds. The surface radiated heat with a density that surprised her each time, even now, even after 6 weeks of the same experiment. The rock did not lie. That was the first thing her father had ever taught her, the only lesson Harlan Flats had not managed to take from her yet. She pulled her hand back, rubbed her palm against her skirt, looked out over the settlement below. 40 families spread across the valley floor, their cabins throwing long morning shadows eastward. She could see the woodpiles from here. They rose beside nearly every structure, like monuments to a particular kind of faith, the faith that brute accumulation could substitute for understanding. Men had been swinging axes since July. The sound carried up to her on still mornings, rhythmic and urgent, the percussion of a community betting its survival on volume. Pile it high enough, burn it fast enough, keep the fire roaring, mean enough through January and February, and maybe the cold would relent. Marin had watched one winter already in this territory. She knew the cold did not relent. She turned back toward her cabin. From the ridge she could see the rear wall clearly, the way it butted up against the slow rise of the hill. The way the logs sat dark with age and the chinking between them. A crumbling mixture of mud and dried grass had developed the faint lacy texture of something already failing. Her husband Elias had noticed it too in the autumn before his last winter. He had pressed his thumb into a gap near the base of the north corner, and a chunk of the mortar fell out into his palm like a tooth. He had looked at it, then looked at her, then made the kind of promise that men make when they are healthy, and the cold is still 3 months away. He would fix it before November. He would get to it. He did not get to it. February came the way it always came to Montana territory, not as a season, but as a verdict. The cold moved through those gaps in the chinking with no more resistance than water moving through a broken dam. The fireplace consumed wood with a hunger that stunned her. She fed it through the night in shifts, sleeping in 2-hour intervals, rising to stack more logs against its open maw, watching the heat blast outward in a brief aggressive wave, and then vanish somewhere above the mantel, while the corners of the room stayed dark and freezing. For every measure of warmth, the fire pushed into the room. The chimney's powerful draw pulled cold air through the walls to replace it. It was not a heating system. It was a machine for making the room colder by degrees while giving the impression of effort. Elias had started coughing in December. By January, the cough had found blood. By February, he could not rise from the cot without her arm under his shoulder, could not speak at length without the effort collapsing into the wet, awful sound that she still heard sometimes when the cabin was too quiet. He died on the 14th of February, 1883, while a storm pressed against the walls outside, and Cale slept curled beside him, one small hand wrapped around his father's fingers. She had buried Elias in ground so hard the pickaxe rang like a bell. She had done it alone because she had not yet understood which neighbors could be asked for that kind of help without the debt of it hanging over the remaining years of her life. She smoothed the mound with her hands when it was done, stood over it in the wind, and did not cry because crying required a stillness inside her that she could not locate. What she located instead over the weeks that followed was something colder than grief, something that had edges. She had been walking back from the ridge on a Tuesday morning in late June when Cale appeared in the doorway of the cabin, still wearing the overlarge shirt he slept in, his red hair brilliant in the early light. He watched her come down the slope with the serious measuring expression he had inherited from nobody. It seemed to have arrived fully formed, a feature of his character rather than his face. He was 8 years old. He had watched his father die by degrees over 2 months in a room that could not hold heat. "Are we going to be cold again, Mama?" His voice was level. Not afraid, he was asking the way he asked about weather, about soil, about the names of birds, as a question that deserved an accurate answer. She stopped on the path. The morning light was doing something complicated with the granite behind the cabin, picking out the mineral variations in the stone, making the face of the hill look briefly like something alive. She said, "Not if I can help it." It was not a reassurance. It was a declaration of the problem she had to solve. Roy Alden had worked the coal seams of Harlan County, Kentucky for 35 years. He had no formal education past the 8th grade, had never seen a university town, would not have known what to do with himself in one. What he knew was rock. He knew it the way a fisherman knows water, not from study, but from submersion, from the accumulated intuition of 10,000 days spent reading stone in the dark. He had started taking Marin underground with him at an age when other fathers were reading their daughters fairy stories, lifting her down into the shaft on his shoulders, talking quietly as he worked about what the stone was telling him. Color, he said, meant everything. A seam running darker meant moisture ahead. A horizontal crack meant the ceiling needed watching. The temperature at different depths told you about the geology above and below, about how far you were from a water table, about how long the rock had been holding whatever heat it carried. Down far enough, he said, the seasons lost their power entirely. The surface of the earth was a place of chaos, freezing, thawing, burning, flooding. 20 feet down, it was none of those things. The rock at that depth held a memory of average temperature of accumulated warmth over decades, releasing it so slowly that the change between January and July was almost imperceptible. It was constant. It was reliable. It was the one thing underground that you could absolutely count on. He had not intended to teach her engineering. He had been talking to keep himself company in the dark. But the lessons had gone in the way things go and when they are learned with the body as much as the mind, and they had stayed. Marin spent June and July on the ridge. She went at different hours taking notes in the small leather journal Elias had given her 2 Christmases past, not writing words, but drawing diagrams. Angles of sun exposure. Times when she felt the surface temperature shift under her hand. Estimations of depth based on the way the granite face met the softer earth at its base, the way moisture moved along the bottom of the formation after rain. She calculated roughly, and by intuition, how much thermal mass the hill represented, how many hours of summer sun had been absorbed into that enormous geological battery over the course of the season, how slowly it would release that warmth as the temperatures dropped. The numbers, such as they were, startled her. She went back up the ridge and stood with both hands flat against the stone and recalculated. The granite face behind her cabin was not a problem. It was the only significant resource she possessed. Everyone in Harlan Flats looked at Widow's Ridge and saw an obstacle, the reason her land was cheap, the reason Elias had been able to file on it at all. Land that abutted a granite outcropping could not be farmed past the first several yards. The neighbors had expressed sympathy when she and Elias first arrived, the particular sympathy that is really a form of condescension. "What a shame," they said, "that you drew this particular parcel." Marin stood on the slope in late July, with the sun hammering down on the exposed rock, and felt the heat radiating back against her face, and thought they had been looking at this wrong. Every one of them. She had developed the rough shape of a plan by the time August arrived, and it terrified her in the specific way that plans terrify people who understand exactly what they will cost. She was not an engineer. She had no tools beyond what Elias had left: a pickaxe, 2 shovels, a mattock, a supply of lamp oil she would need to ration carefully. She had no money for labor, no standing in the community that might bring volunteers, no margin for failure in terms of time. The aspens would turn in 6 weeks. The first hard frost would come after 8. The deep cold that had killed Elias would arrive somewhere between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and it would stay until March. She had 1 summer left to change what the winter would find when it came to her door. She began by taking apart the back wall of the fireplace. The fireplace was the cabin's largest structural feature and its greatest deception, a monument to misguided thinking. Its throat so wide and its draw so powerful that it consumed wood at a rate that made her stomach tighten every time she calculated the winter's supply against the night's remaining. She had watched it operate for 1 full winter. It produced the impression of heat while systematically evacuating it from the room. The open design pulled every molecule of warm air upward and out, and the vacuum it created dragged replacement air in through every crack in the cabin walls. You did not heat a room with this design. You heated the immediate 3 feet in front of it, while the rest of the space dropped below comfort. She was going to replace it. She was going to build something smaller, tighter, more deliberate. a firebox designed for intense, efficient combustion rather than theatrical display. From the back of that new firebox, she would cut a horizontal flue 40 feet long, running directly into the body of the hill. At the far end, she would construct a vertical chimney rising above the slope's surface. The exhaust gases would travel that 40-foot channel before escaping, and along every foot of the journey, they would transfer their heat to the stone and clay surrounding them. The stone would hold that heat for hours. The hill would become a radiator. The floor of the cabin, the back wall, the very structure she lived in, would become the source of warmth rather than merely a container for air she was frantically trying to keep warm. She started tearing out the old firebox on the morning of August 3rd. She had been at it for 2 hours when she became aware that she was being observed. She turned to find Josie Pratt standing at the open door of the cabin, holding a cloth-covered dish, taking in the scene with an expression that was neither alarmed nor amused. Josie was the wife of Harlan Flat's blacksmith, a lean, practical woman of 41 whose entire manner suggested she had long ago made peace with the world being difficult and had decided to feed people through it anyway. "I made extra cornbread," Josie said. Her eyes moved from the dismantled hearth to the growing pile of displaced stone to Marin, who was covered in mortar dust and holding a pry bar. "What are you doing?" Marin told her. She kept it to 3 minutes: the firebox, the tunnel, the hill, the thermal mass, the slow release of stored heat through a long winter night. She used her hands to show the angles. Josie was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, "What do you need me to do?" "Nothing else. No questions about whether it would work. No offers of alternative suggestions. No expression of the gentle skepticism that was Harlan Flat's dominant social register." Marin looked at her for a moment, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. "Help me with Kale when I'm too deep in the tunnel to keep an eye on him." Josie set the cornbread on the table. "Done." The rest of the settlement was less direct about its reservations. Edmund Hargrave arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 2 of his regular laborers trailing him at a respectful distance, their presence communicating more clearly than any announcement that this was an official visit. Hargrave was 58 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the particular posture of a man who had spent decades expecting structures to conform to his instructions. His hands were the most expressive thing about him, enormous, scarred, calloused into something closer to implement than anatomy, perpetually making small evaluative movements as if measuring invisible distances. He had built nearly everything in Harlan Flats that mattered: the church, the community storehouse, the bridge over Bitter Creek that the spring floods had twice tested without managing to move. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned through long experience and genuine skill that there was a correct way to do things, that the correct way had been arrived at through generations of trial and error, that deviation from it produced structures that collapsed or burned or let the cold in. His confidence was not arrogance in the simple sense. It was the confidence of competence, which is a different thing entirely, though from the outside they can be difficult to distinguish. He had a son, Thomas, 19 years old, who had left for Philadelphia the previous year to study structural engineering at an institution that taught theory from books rather than from stone and lumber. When Thomas had climbed onto the train, Hargrave had said, "A man who won't trust his hands doesn't deserve to call himself a builder." Thomas had not written since. Ruth Hargrave, Edmund's wife, had watched the train leave from beside her husband and said nothing at all, which was, between them, a complete sentence. Hargrave looked at what Marin had done to the cabin wall. He looked at the tunnel opening, barely begun, its timber shoring still raw. He looked at the dismantled firebox, the new and smaller firebox frame she had begun to construct at the tunnel's mouth. "Mistress Calloway," his voice was accustomed to carrying over wind and construction noise, "I am going to ask you to explain this. I'm building a heat exchange system." She set down the mattock. A long flue into the hill, a small, efficient firebox at the mouth. The exhaust heats the stone along the way. The stone radiates that heat back into the cabin for hours after the fire is out. He processed it, not dismissing it immediately, which she had expected, but actually working through the mechanics, which she had not. He was, despite everything, a man who thought carefully about how things worked. "The draw," he said at last. "When the gas cools in your tunnel and loses its buoyancy, what keeps the draft alive at 40 below?" It was a real question. A good one. She had been wrestling with it for 2 weeks, running the calculations at night when sleep would not come. The vertical chimney at the tunnel's end, she said. The gas emerging there, even cooled, is still warmer than the ambient air outside. That differential sustains the draw if the firebox is producing a hot, fast burn at the source. You need intensity at the beginning to maintain movement through the length. He turned this over. She could see him doing it the actual consultation with 40 years of practical knowledge. It's unproven, he said. Most things were before they were proven. His expression shifted into something harder than simple doubt. You have never built anything like this. No one in this territory has. You have a boy of 8 in that cabin. The pause that followed had weight in it. What gives you the right to stake his life on a theory? The question landed where he intended it to land. She held it for a moment without flinching. His father's death gives me the right, Mr. Hargrave. Her voice stayed level, not hard level, the way a true floor is level. The cold has already made its bet. I watched it collect on that bet last February. I am making a different one. Hargrave looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the tunnel opening and the careful angles of the new firebox frame with the involuntary professional assessment that came before any considered judgment. He offered to have some men help her rebuild the chimney properly, the conventional design done right. She thanked him and turned back to her work. He left. His laborers fell in behind him. The community meeting that Hargrave called the following week was framed as a discussion of settlement safety. The room above the general store held most of Harlan Flats' adult population. The proposal on the table was guardianship, framed as generosity, structured as a removal of Cale from Marin's care through the coldest months. Marin had not been invited. She attended anyway, arriving after the meeting had begun, taking a position near the back wall with Cale's hand quiet in hers. Aldrich Voss spoke before Marin could organize a response. Doc Voss was 52 years old, had come west from Boston for reasons involving his own lungs, and had established himself as a fixture of such quiet reliability that people sometimes forgot he was there until they needed him. He rose from the front bench with the deliberate economy of movement that characterized everything he did. I have delivered 42 children in this territory. 42. He let that settle. I know the difference between a woman who has lost her mind and a woman who has made up her mind. Mrs. Calloway has made up hers. I would suggest we leave her to it. The vote went 23-17 in Hargrave's favor. Marin heard the numbers and felt the arithmetic of her isolation settle over her with a precision that was almost clarifying. More than a third of the room had sided against the intervention, more than she had expected. She looked across at Ruth Hargrave, who sat 3 seats from her husband, her hands folded in her lap. Ruth had been one of the 17. Hargrave had seen it too. On the walk home, the two of them moved through the evening air in the particular silence of a marriage processing information it would not address directly. The vote had no real mechanism of enforcement. What it accomplished was something more complete than prohibition. It drew a line. It made official the consensus that Marin Calloway was not to be helped, not to be waited for, not to be included in the mutual support that a frontier community extended to its members as a matter of survival. She walked home with Cale's hand in hers, looked up at Widow's Ridge in the dark, the granite face pale under the half-moon, substantial against the stars. Somewhere inside that rock summer was still happening. The season's warmth banked into stone, the way coals are banked against morning, patient and indifferent to what had been decided in the room above the general store. She had 6 weeks. Every one of them would count for more than the last. The tunnel taught her things the surface never could. In the first days of digging, when the earth was still cooperative and the work moved at a pace that felt almost encouraging, Marin learned that underground had its own grammar. Sound behaved differently. The scrape of the mattock against soil came back to her ears with a flatness, a deadness, as if the earth were absorbing the noise rather than reflecting it. The lamp flame moved in ways that had nothing to do with wind, responding instead to the subtle pressure changes caused by her own movement in the confined space. The smell was layered surface soil first, then something older beneath it, a mineral coldness that had nothing organic in it, the smell of geological time rather than season. She worked in stretches of 2 hours, sometimes 3, when progress was good. Cale sat at the tunnel entrance with the second lamp, the light making him a small, bright shape at the edge of her world. He talked to her. He narrated things he could see from the entrance. A hawk working the updraft along the ridge, the angle of afternoon light shifting across the valley floor, the sound of axes from the settlement below carrying up on the still air. His voice was the thread she followed back to the surface when the walls pressed too close, and the lamp smoke thickened, and the dark began to feel less like absence than like presence. The first week produced 8 feet of channel, which was less than she had planned. Her hands, already roughened by a year of frontier maintenance, developed a new category of damage. Not blisters, which she knew how to manage, but deeper bruising in the heel of each palm, where the mattock handle transferred its shock upward through bone. She wrapped them at night with strips cut from a flour sack. In the morning, she unwrapped them, assessed the damage with the clinical attention of someone who cannot afford to be sentimental about her own body, then rewrapped them tighter and went back down. Kyle brought her water every 45 minutes with the regularity of a small red-haired clock. He did not ask how much longer. He did not ask if she was sure. On the 5th day, he appeared at the tunnel mouth with the water pail in one hand and her father's Bible in the other. She had not asked for. It had not known she needed it, and he sat cross-legged at the entrance and read aloud while she worked. He read without performance, without the self-consciousness that children often bring to adult texts they don't fully understand. He read the way he did most things as a task worthy of his full attention. She was 12 feet in when he read the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and she stopped. Not because the words undid her, because they were exact, because someone had written them down in full knowledge of what that valley felt like, the specific quality of its darkness, and had gone through it anyway, and the going through was the whole point of the passage. She held the mattock handle against her chest for 30 seconds in the dark. Then she drove the blade back into the earth and worked faster than she had worked all week. The hard layer found her on the 19th day. She hit it without warning. The mattock rang against it with a sound that traveled up her arms to her back teeth. A sound that meant density, meant geological stubbornness, meant that the cooperative earth of the first 18 days had been exceptional rather than representative. She held the lamp close to the exposed face. Quartzite or something, near enough a band of stone running through the softer material, at an angle she could not immediately calculate its edges, interlocked in a way that suggested the band was wide rather than thin, a geological layer rather than an isolated intrusion. She sat back on her heels in the tunnel and did the arithmetic. She was halfway. 20 feet completed, 20 feet remaining before she reached the position she had calculated for the vertical chimney shaft. She could not go around the tunnel's path, had been engineered to run through the most thermally dense section of the hill's interior. She could not go over or under without compromising the angle of the flue. The quartzite was not an obstacle. It was the problem she had not seen coming. She came out of the tunnel that evening and sat on the slope while Cale heated the beans, looking at nothing in particular, letting her mind work the way it worked best, when she gave it silence rather than direction. Her father's voice came to her not as memory exactly, more as a tool she had internalized so completely it felt like her own thinking. He had told her about a seam in the Harlan County mine that had seemed to dead end against a shelf of harder stone. The older miners had treated it as a finality. Her father had sat with it for a week, watching where moisture appeared on the hard face where the color shifted. Then he had built a controlled fire directly against the stone's surface, fed it for 4 hours, then doused it with cold water drawn from the shaft's sump. The thermal shock had done in one afternoon what pickaxes could not accomplish in a week. The stone fractured along its natural fault lines. Lines it had always possessed, that the fire and water had simply convinced it to acknowledge. He called it the old way. No proper name, no formal designation, just knowledge passed down through generations of men who had learned it from the men before them. Practical information about the behavior of stone under stress. The kind of thing that never makes it into books, because the people who know it are too busy using it to write anything down. She built the fire against the quartzite face the next morning. She fed it carefully, managing the heat rather than simply stoking it, not a matter of burning as hot as possible, but of applying sustained even heat across the largest surface area she could manage in the confined space. The smoke was a serious problem. She had constructed a simple draw baffle at the tunnel's mouth, a tilted board that encouraged smoke to move outward rather than accumulate, but the system was imperfect. Cale rigged an improvised bellows from a feed sack that pushed fresh air in along the tunnel floor while she worked. They had worked it out together over breakfast, drawing on the cabin floor with a charred stick, Cale asking questions about airflow that were more perceptive than she had expected from an 8-year-old who had never read a word about physics. 4 hours of fire. Then the water, 2 full buckets, poured fast against the heated face, the steam exploding backward through the tunnel in a wave that forced her flat against the opposite wall, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. When the steam cleared, she held the lamp to the quartzite face. It had fractured. Not catastrophically, not in the dramatic way she had hoped, but in a series of diagonal cracks that ran from upper left to lower right across the band's face, following fault lines that the rock had been carrying inside itself since the geology of Montana was still being decided. She worked the pry bar into the largest crack. The first section broke free and fell. Behind it was something she had not calculated for. The clay ran in a vein perhaps 8 inches thick along the far side of the quartzite band, a deposit of dense, smooth material the color of old brick, the kind that fired hard and held heat with exceptional efficiency, the kind that did not crack under temperature stress. It ran at least as far as her lamp could illuminate in both directions, which meant it ran the length of the remaining tunnel, possibly farther. She pulled a piece free and worked it between her fingers. It was exactly what it appeared to be. The obstacle she had spent 4 days defeating had been sitting in front of the most useful material on her property. She did not attribute it to luck. She attributed it to depth, to the fact that useful things are often precisely where the difficult things are, that the clay was there because the geology that produced the hard layer was the same geology that had produced the deposit, that these things traveled together if you went far enough to find them. The earth rewards the one who goes deep enough to deserve the reward. That had been her father's version of it, and she had no better one. She came out of the tunnel that evening with her hands full of the clay, and her face carrying an expression that Cale studied carefully before he said anything. It got better in there, didn't it? It got considerably better. She lined the remaining 20 feet of the tunnel with the clay over the following week, pressing it against the stone walls and ceiling in a layer 3 inches thick, smoothing the joints, allowing each section to begin its initial cure before moving to the next. The work required a different quality of attention than the digging. Less brute application, more patience, the kind of precision that is harder on the mind than on the body. Her hands learned the clay's responses to pressure the way hands learn any material given sufficient time and sufficient necessity. Josie Pratt appeared most mornings, now arriving without announcement, doing what was useful without requiring direction. She kept Cale fed through the days when Marin forgot meals entirely. She resold his boots using leather she had negotiated from her husband's shop inventory. One afternoon, she sat at the tunnel entrance with her mending basket while Cale slept in the cabin, not talking, simply occupying the space in a way that communicated clearly that Marin was not entirely alone in this, whatever the formal community position might be. One evening, Josie said it plainly. "I don't know if it'll work, but I know you're not wrong." Then she folded her mending and walked back down the hill. Marin turned that over in her mind for several days. There was a distinction in it worth preserving between knowing something would work and knowing it was not wrong. The second was a matter of the underlying principle rather than the outcome. Josie was not predicting success. She was saying that the reasoning was honest, that whatever happened when January arrived, the thinking behind it was not the thinking of someone who had stopped reasoning clearly. It was Marin decided the most useful thing anyone had said to her since August. Doc Voss came twice during the digging weeks. Both times he arrived in the late afternoon carrying his medical bag from habit, though he had left its contents at his office. He asked about the tunnel dimensions, the clay lining, the chimney draft calculations. His questions were careful, the questions of a man trained to observe and record rather than to intervene. He wrote in his notebook while she talked small, precise handwriting that she caught glimpses of but did not read. On his second visit, he said quietly, "I want to document the design, in detail. Whatever happens this winter, the principle should be recorded somewhere more permanent than your memory." She gave him the measurements. She walked him through the thermal logic. She realized, building a record that could exist independently of her, that would still be legible if January produced the outcome that Edmund Hargrave had predicted with such calm certainty. She did not find this morbid. She found it responsible. The letter from Thomas Hargrave arrived at the settlement's postal distribution point at the end of September. She knew its general contents through the ordinary movement of conversation in a small community, filtered through several interpretive layers by the time it reached her, but the substance was consistent across versions. Thomas was writing from Philadelphia about heat, about the way the old stone meeting houses of New England had stayed functional through brutal winters on quantities of wood that should not have been sufficient, because the mass of their construction held and radiated warmth in ways their builders had understood by intuition rather than calculation. Thomas was asking in his letter whether anyone in the Montana territories had ever thought about applying similar principles to frontier cabins. She heard this and felt something settle in her chest. Not vindication, more like the particular satisfaction of knowing that a question you had been working on alone had been arrived at independently by another mind, which meant the question was real, which meant the answer existed somewhere in the physical world, waiting to be correctly described. Thomas Hargrave was studying in Philadelphia what she was building into a hillside with a mattock in her father's memory. She wondered if Edmund Hargrave had read the letter more than once. She suspected he had read it several times and set it down each time without knowing what to do with it. The tunnel was finished on the 15th of October. The aspens already past their peak, the air carrying the specific gravity of a season in transition. 40 feet from the firebox mouth to the base of the vertical chimney shaft. She had lined the last section of clay 2 days prior, pressing each course of material into the joints with particular care, knowing that this section would carry the first surge of exhaust gas and that the thermal shock of the initial fires would test every weakness she had left in the construction. She built the new firebox over 3 days. It was nothing like the gaping, greedy structures she had dismantled in August, small, tall, insulated on 3 sides, with sections of the clay deposit she had reserved specifically for this purpose, designed for a vertical combustion column where fire could achieve maximum heat with minimum fuel. The sealed design forced combustion to complete itself rather than allowing partially burned gases to escape, which meant it consumed its fuel more thoroughly and produced a hotter, cleaner exhaust stream with more thermal energy to surrender along the 40-foot channel ahead. She sealed the old chimney flue with stone and clay mortar she had prepared from the deposit. That act took her longer than she had expected, not because it was technically difficult, but because of what it represented. She was closing the door on the conventional approach entirely. The cabin now had no connection to the sky except through the tunnel and the distant chimney on the ridge above. If her calculations were wrong, if the draw failed, if the exhaust backed up into the cabin on a still night in January, there was no fallback position. She had engineered away every option except success. She mixed the last batch of mortar with her hands, pressed it into the old flue opening, smoothed the joint flat. The work of a minute, the commitment of a winter. The first test fire happened on the evening of October 19th. She used dry pine carefully sized for the firebox dimensions arranged to produce the vertical combustion column the design required. The fire caught with the quick, intense authority of a draft that was working. She could hear the draw immediately, a low movement of air through the firebox that told her the tunnel was pulling. The flame was not large. It was brilliant, almost white at its core, the combustion clean in a way the old fireplace had never managed. She sat in the cabin with her back against the opposite wall. An hour passed. The firebox worked as designed. The tunnel carried the exhaust. The air in the cabin stayed clean without the smoke tang that had been a permanent feature of the previous winter's interior atmosphere. 90 minutes in, she moved to the back wall. She spread both palms flat against the stone. Nothing yet. She moved to the floor near the back corner, kneeling, pressing her palm against the boards. Still cold. She fed the firebox 2 more pieces of pine, returned to her position against the far wall, pulled her knees up and waited. Cale was asleep in the corner, his breathing the slow, even rhythm of a child who has worked hard enough to sleep without difficulty. The lamp was turned low. The fire burned on its own with the self-sustaining intensity of a properly engineered system. 2 hours and 40 minutes after she had lit the fire, she put her hand on the back wall again. The warmth was so subtle that for a moment she was not certain she was feeling it, rather than constructing it out of exhaustion and hope. She pressed harder, both palms flat, holding herself still enough to remove any possibility of self-deception. The stone was warm, not hot, not radiating the aggressive heat of a fire at close range. Warm the way a living thing is warm, the way the granite on Widow's Ridge was warm at mid-morning in July. Steadily from within, without drama, without the fluctuation of something performing rather than simply being. She pressed her forehead against the wall. The cold of the outer surface met her skin, but behind that surface the heat was there. The earth's slow exhalation, the summer banked into granite, finally finding its way through. She held that position for a long time, her eyes closed, her breath steadying by degrees. Her father had worked 35 years in the dark on the faith that the earth operated by rules. That if you learned the rules and worked with them rather than against them, the earth would give back what you put in according to laws older than anything a person could construct in opposition to them. She finally understood what he had meant not as information, but as fact with both hands pressed against warm stone at the back of a Montana cabin in the middle of October. She had asked the right question. The earth had answered. The cold arrived without announcement, the way serious things often do. Through November, the temperature dropped in increments that felt almost negotiable, cold mornings warming by midday, the nights requiring extra blankets, but nothing beyond what a prepared household could manage. Marin ran the firebox twice daily in short burns, learning the system's rhythms, the way you learn a new instrument, paying attention to how the stone responded at different ambient temperatures, how long the warmth persisted in the back wall after the fire went cold, how the floor's radiant temperature varied depending on where she stood. She kept notes in the leather journal, the data accumulated with the quiet confidence of something that was working. December brought a harder argument. The temperature stopped its daily negotiations. It dropped into the 20s and stayed the sky taking on the flat white opacity of a ceiling lowered too far, the creek below the settlement running sluggish at its edges. Families in Harlan flats pulled inward their social perimeters, contracting to the radius of their woodpiles. Marin watched smoke rise from 40 chimneys on the valley floor and understood exactly what she was seeing. 40 separate battles being fought with the same losing strategy, 40 households feeding fire to the sky while the cold pressed through their walls unimpeded. Her own firebox burned it each morning for an hour, sometimes less. The wood consumption startled her even now, knowing it intellectually from the calculations she had done in September. To look at the pile beside the cabin, modest, deliberate, the size that had drawn pity from passing neighbors in August, and understand that it would be sufficient was to understand something that numbers alone could not fully communicate. She was not fighting the cold. She had changed the terrain of the engagement entirely. Kyle took his boots off indoors in early November, sitting on the floor near the back wall with his carved wooden figures, and she watched him pull one boot off, then the other, setting them aside with the casual confidence of a child who knows the floor beneath him is safe. He never put them back on inside after that. By December, he occasionally left his second shirt on its peg near the door. She did not tell him what that cost her to witness her son warm on a warm floor in a Montana winter alive, in the specific way his father had not been able to stay alive. She kept the feeling in a place that language had not yet reached. January reached Harlan Flats on the 9th. Not a date she recorded, but one she felt in the quality of silence that arrived with the cold front, a silence that had texture that pressed against the ears with the specific density of air that had traveled a very long way from somewhere worse. The temperature fell through the night. By morning, it had reached 20 below zero. By the following afternoon, it was 30 below. The sky took the color that old-timers in the settlement called the blue stillness, the particular hue of a cold that intended to stay. It stayed. Trees in the timber above the settlement began to explode on the third night, the sap in their cores freezing, expanding, splitting the wood from inside, with a sound like rifle shots in the dark. Cale woke at the first one, sat up in his blankets, listened to the next one farther off. He looked at Marin across the dark cabin. The trees. I know. He lay back down. She lay listening to the forest making its damage known throughout the night. Each report a reminder of what 40 below did to things that had no strategy beyond endurance. She ran the firebox that morning for 90 minutes, the combustion column burning with the focused intensity she had learned to produce through careful attention to airflow. The wood consumption was 3 pieces of split pine. She let the fire die naturally sealed. The firebox went about her morning. By midday, the back wall was radiating steadily. By early afternoon, the floor near the hillside wall had reached a temperature she could feel clearly through her boot soles, not a point source of heat, but a broad, even warmth distributed across several square feet of flooring the earth's patient generosity made structural. The evening burn lasted 45 minutes. She used 2 pieces of wood. In Edmund Hargrave's house, the calculus was entirely different. His house was the best in Harlan Flats Square. Corners tight construction, a chimney he had built to exacting specifications. By every conventional measure, it was the most defensible structure in the settlement against this kind of cold. The fireplace consumed wood with the efficiency of a well-designed conventional system, which meant it consumed it faster than a lesser design because the draft was stronger, the draw more powerful. The pump action of hot air rising, pulling replacement, cold air through every gap in the construction with greater force. You did not heat a room with a fireplace of that design. You heated the immediate space in front of it while the cold owned everything else. On the seventh day of the deep cold, Hargrave burned the small table from the back bedroom. On the 12th, the bookshelf that had come west in pieces from Ohio reassembled in Montana as a declaration that civilization had followed them here. On the 14th day in the late afternoon when the light failed early, he carried into the main room the small chair that his son Thomas had built at age 11 from a catalog kit assembled over 2 winter weekends with a concentration that had surprised Hargrave at the time. He set it on the fire. He watched the wood his son had fitted together take the flame. The thing that moved through him in that moment had no name that he could speak aloud. His daughter Sarah had begun coughing on the 16th day, a dry, shallow cough that lived in the upper chest, not yet serious, but containing within it the blueprint for becoming so. Ruth had packed extra blankets around her in the corner nearest the fireplace. The child's face when the fire was high was flushed. Her back turned away from the heat was cold to the touch through the blankets. The fireplace heated a radius. It did not heat a room. Doc Voss came on the 17th day, working his rounds through the settlement with the methodical persistence of a man who understood that presence was itself a form of medicine. He examined Sarah, listened to her chest, felt her forehead. Then he straightened and looked at Hargrave across the room with the steady gaze of a man who had seen this particular failure before. "She needs warmth that lasts through the night, Edmund." His voice was quiet, precise, without judgment. "Not warmth that eats itself by midnight." He left without elaborating. He did not need to. Hargrave stood in the center of his best room in his best house and felt the cold moving along the floor near his boots, the same cold that had taken Elias Calloway in a cabin with worse construction. He had believed, genuinely believed, that superior craftsmanship would be sufficient, that the correct application of known principles executed with skill would hold against anything the territory's winter could bring. He was watching it fail in real time, and there was no version of his understanding that explained why. The 19th day arrived with a temperature the small thermometer outside his window recorded at 41 below zero. He had no more furniture to burn. He had a wood pile he could see the end of. He had a sick daughter in the corner and a wife who had not slept fully in a week. His mind kept returning with the involuntary persistence of a tongue returning to a missing tooth to a single image, the lamp in Marin Calloway's window burning steady and warm, as he had seen it 3 nights ago on his way back from the storehouse. Not distress, not the guttering light of a household managing a crisis, just a house with a lit lamp as ordinary as a summer evening. He dressed in every layer he owned. He moved to the door. From behind him, Ruth's voice came quiet through the dark room. "Come back with something useful, Edmund." Not a question, not quite a blessing. Something between permission and instruction from a woman who had been waiting for him to make this particular decision for a very long time. He stepped outside. The cold received him, the way cold at 40 below receives everything, without hostility, without drama, without any quality that could be called personal. It simply was massive and indifferent in Arctic winter that had traveled 1,000 miles of open country and arrived with every degree of its original force intact. His breath turned to vapor before it cleared his lips. The snow under his boots was dry beyond any ordinary moisture, compacted to a substance that squealed with each step the complaint of crystals under pressure, an alien sound in the absolute stillness. He told himself he was going for her wood. She was dead. He was almost certain she was dead, had been certain of it for a week, and her wood supply would still be stacked beside the cabin. He told himself this with the practiced firmness of a man saying something he does not fully believe, pushing past the moral weight of it with the image of his daughter's shallow breathing. He moved across the frozen ground toward Widow's Ridge with his chin down and his mind doing what minds do when they have been pushed past the point of strategy. It's simplified, reduced to the next step, the next 30 feet of ground between him and the slope. He was 50 feet from the cabin when he saw the lamp. He stopped. The light was the warm color of good oil burning cleanly, not the yellow-orange flicker of a fire struggling against its own exhaust, not the movement of something maintained at desperate cost. It was still. steady, the light of a household going about an ordinary evening. Then he heard Cale's voice, high, clear, completely untroubled, reading something aloud from inside, the cadence of a child working through a text with care and attention. The voice was warm, not as a quality of sound, but as a quality of circumstance. A child who was not cold, reading in a room that was not cold on an evening that posed no threat. Hargrave moved to the door. He raised his fist to knock, but it opened before he reached it. Maren stood in the doorway without a coat, dressed for an ordinary evening. The light behind her outlined the set of her shoulders, the unhurried quality of someone who had not been managing a crisis, who had simply been living in a warm house, doing the ordinary things that people do when they are not afraid of the temperature outside. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, directly, without the social architecture that normally stood between people's faces and what they were actually thinking. "How is Sarah?" Her voice carried no edge of vindication. It was the question of someone who had already been where he was standing, past pride, past the sustainable distance between asking for help and not asking for it. His voice broke on the second word. "She's not well." She stepped back from the doorway and opened it wider. He walked in. The warmth did not announce itself. It was simply present, not the aggressive heat of a fire working at capacity, not the point source intensity of a hearth demanding proximity. It occupied the room the way light occupies a room when the sun has been on it all day. He stood inside the door and felt it on his face, his hands moving through his coat with a gentleness that was almost shocking after the violence of the cold outside. He looked for the fire. The firebox was small, set low in the back wall, and what burned in it was barely a fire by his understanding of the word, a compact bed of coals, a few small pieces of wood burning at a rate that would exhaust them in 20 minutes. By any conventional measure, it was producing not enough heat to warm a room half this size on a mild autumn evening. Kyle looked up from his book. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor in his shirt sleeves, his expression the same serious and observant one. It always was unconcerned with the temperature in the room, because the temperature in the room gave him nothing to be concerned about. Hargrave's knees found the floor before he decided to kneel. His right hand pressed flat against the boards. The wood was warm, not floor near a fire. Warm, not a surface temperature produced by proximity to a heat source, but warm from below, a broad, even heat that had no localized origin, because it had no localized origin. It was coming from within the structure itself, from the earth beneath it, from the stone and clay that had been absorbing heat since morning, and were now releasing it, the way the summer granite on the ridge released the sun's warmth into the September evenings, slowly, steadily, without exhausting itself. He rose, moved to the back wall, pressed both palms against the stone. The warmth there was deeper, more substantial, a radiating mass of stored heat releasing its energy into the room's air over hours, over the whole length of a winter night, giving back what had been put into it with a patience that no fire could match. He lowered himself to one knee on the warm floor. He was a man who had built everything in this settlement with his hands, who had trusted those hands for 30 years, who had measured his worth in the structures his skill produced. He was kneeling on the floor of a cabin that had defeated the coldest night in the territory's recorded history, on 3 pieces of pine in the memory of a summer stored in stone. He looked up at her. Everything he had built, every structure he had raised with his knowledge and his confidence and his certainty about the correct way of doing things, all of it receded behind the single, undeniable fact of this warm floor, this warm wall, this woman standing before him in an ordinary dress on an extraordinary night. One word came out carrying the weight of everything it was displacing. How? Maren took a piece of cold charcoal from the firebox edge. She lowered herself to the floor across from him. Cale shifting naturally to sit between them, with the ease of a child who understands, without being told, that he belongs in the conversation. She drew on the warm boards, the firebox, small, insulated, burning hot, the long channel running into the hill, the clay lining that absorbed heat from the passing exhaust, the granite mass beyond it, holding that heat for hours, the vertical chimney at the far end sustaining the draft. Her hands moved through the diagram with the precision of someone who had drawn this in her mind 6 months before she drew it anywhere else. "You make the fire burn hot enough that it consumes itself completely," she said, her voice unhurried. "No waste in the smoke, no wasted heat in the exhaust. Then you make that exhaust travel a long road before you let it go to the sky." Her finger traced the tunnel's length on the floor. Every foot of the journey, it pays what it owes. It pays the clay. It pays the stone. The stone remembers what it's been given. She looked up at him. The earth doesn't forget warmth the way air forgets it. Air loses heat immediately. It rises, it escapes. It's gone the moment the fire drops. Stone holds. Stone is patient in a way that fire never learned to be. Cale's voice entered the quiet that followed with the natural authority of someone stating something he considers settled. The rock doesn't forget Mr. Hargrave. It holds summer inside it all, winter long, if you ask it right. Hargrave looked at the boy for a long moment. Something moved in his face that had been fixed for years, a loosening of the certainty that had set itself into his features, so gradually he had stopped noticing it was there. He thought of Thomas at 11 building that chair with concentrated care over 2 winter weekends. He thought of Thomas asking questions in the woodshop that he had answered too briefly or not answered at all. He thought of the letter from Philadelphia sitting on his table at home, describing the same principle that was radiating up through his palm from this warm floor. The letter he had read 3 times and set down without knowing how to respond. He had been building shields his whole life. What he was kneeling on was a source. Marin set a small bundle of wood on the floor beside him, not much enough for a night's fire, and the charcoal diagram she had drawn the floor still warm beneath it. "Come back tomorrow with your tools," she said. "There's a simpler version, 6 feet of tunnel 1, good stone mass positioned right. We can build it in the worst-off households in a day. It won't be perfect. It will be enough." He looked at the diagram. "You want me to build your design?" "I want Sarah to stop coughing." She held his gaze. "The design has no interest in whose name belongs to it." He picked up the wood. He picked up the diagram, folded it once, placed it inside his coat against his chest. At the door he paused with his hand on the latch. He did not turn around, but his voice came back into the warm room with the particular quality of something being said that cannot be unsaid. Something being put into the world that changes the shape of what comes after. "I was wrong." The words moved through him like something structural giving way, not collapsing, releasing. The difference between a wall coming down under pressure and a wall being taken down deliberately to make room for something that fits better. "About the design, about what you were doing in this hillside, I was wrong." He opened the door. The cold met him again with its vast impersonal force. He walked back through the dark settlement with a bundle of wood in one arm and a folded diagram against his chest. And the cold was the same cold it had been on the way out. Unchanged, unimpressed, indifferent to whatever had shifted in the man moving through it. But the man moving through it was not the same man. Ruth was at the table when he came in. She looked at his face before she looked at what he was carrying, and whatever she saw there made her stand up and put her hand briefly on his arm as he passed. Not a question, an acknowledgement. He went to the table and spread the diagram flat under the lamp. He did not eat. He studied it for 2 hours with the concentrated attention he had always given to a new structural problem, except this time he was not looking for the flaw. He was learning the logic, following it from first principle to last feeling. It became part of his understanding of how heat moved through material and time. At first light, he was at Marin's cabin with his tools. He brought the 2 laborers he trusted, most men who built what he told them to build without requiring a full explanation first. He had given them an explanation anyway in the pre-dawn cold outside his house, speaking quietly. He told them what he had found in the cabin on the ridge. He told them it worked. He told them to set aside what they thought they knew about heating a structure because he had done the same, and the doing of it had cost him considerably, and it was the most important thing he had learned in 40 years of building. Working from the diagram with Marin directing the placement of the stone mass and the tunnel angle, they completed the first emergency installation in the home of a family whose children had been sleeping in coats for a week. The installation was crude compared to what Marin had built, 6 feet of clay-packed channel instead of 40, a single large granite block, as the thermal mass rather than the hill itself, a short chimney that rose barely above the roofline. It was not elegant. It was enough. The stone mass absorbed the heat of a 2-hour morning fire and radiated it back for 11 hours through the afternoon, through the dangerous small hours of the night, through the coldest period before the sun returned. They built 4 more installations over the following 3 days. Hargrave moved through the settlement with the diagram against his chest, knocking on doors saying the words he had never said in 40 years of building. "I was wrong. Do it her way." The men who had followed his instructions without question for years followed them now in the opposite direction with the same fidelity. That was the nature of earned authority it transferred to the new position when the authority was genuine. Sarah Hargrave's fever broke on the third morning after the installation in her corner of the house. Ruth placed her hand on the child's forehead in the early light and felt the difference. The hot, dry urgency of fever replaced by the moist, ordinary warmth of a child's natural temperature. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with her hand still resting there, not praying exactly, doing something quieter than prayer, something more like gratitude expressed toward no particular address. The deep cold broke in early March, receding not dramatically but by degrees, the way serious things often end without announcement, without ceremony, the temperature climbing back through the range of the survivable, and then into the range of the merely uncomfortable, and then one morning into something that could be called almost mild. The creek found its voice again under the thinning ice. The south-facing slopes showed the first gray-green suggestion of what would eventually become grass. No one in Harlan Flats had died. Not from cold, not from the smoke of desperate fires, not from the cascading failures that followed when cold and hunger and exhaustion converged on a body that had been fighting too long with the wrong tools. The neighboring settlement of Cold Creek, 12 miles east, had lost 3 people in the same cold event. Doc Voss noted this in his documentation without comment. The numbers spoke with sufficient precision on their own. When the ground softened enough to work, Hargrave rebuilt the Callaway system from its foundation outward, using the best materials available to him, fired clay pipe for the flue channel, dressed granite blocks for the thermal mass. A chimney constructed to the precise draft calculations Marin had worked out in the prior autumn. He rebuilt it the way he built everything, with the attention of a man who takes his name seriously, except this time his name was not going on it. He commissioned a small bronze plate from the settlement's blacksmith, Josie Pratt's husband, who had more range with metal than most people knew. The plate was simple, the lettering clean and without flourish. The Callaway system. He fixed it to the stone above the firebox with 4 brass screws set level and square, the way he set everything. He stood back and looked at it for a moment, then picked up his tools and went to the next house that needed the work done. Doc Voss sent his full documentation to the American builder in Boston in September of 1884. The thermal calculations, the construction specifications, the clay lining technique, the draft equations for varying chimney heights at different ambient temperatures, and a full accounting of Harlan Flats' winter outcomes compared to Cold Creek. The journal published it in its winter issue. The editor did not know, because Voss had not specified it, that the design had originated with a widow who had never attended an engineering lecture, who had learned everything she needed from a man who talked to himself in the dark of a Kentucky coal mine. Marin did not seek out the article. A copy reached Harlan Flats, eventually passed around the settlement with the reverence objects acquire when they have traveled from somewhere considered important. But by the time it arrived, she had moved on to the next problem. The land presented a drainage issue threatening the root cellar, a garden plan that needed to account for the shortened growing season at this elevation. The system in the hill behind her cabin continued to function with the reliability of something built on honest principles. She ran the firebox each morning for an hour. The stone held what it was given. The winter, when it came again, found a different kind of house waiting for it. On a morning in early May, she climbed Widow's Ridge before the settlement woke, stood with her palm flat against the granite face in the early cold. The stone was at its minimum winter's deposits, finally spent the thermal debt of the cold months, settled to zero. By June, it would begin absorbing again, banking the summer's heat in its deep interior, patient and precise, and entirely indifferent to the human drama being conducted at its base. She stood for a long time with her eyes on the valley below, watching the smoke begin to rise from the first morning fires, the light coming flat across the eastern ridge, the settlement going about the ordinary business of a morning that had not cost anyone anything to reach. 7 of those cabins now had the Callaway system running in their walls. More would be built before next winter. Hargrave had already drawn up specifications for a version using pre-fired clay pipe that could be installed in 3 hours by 2 men who knew what they were doing. Kyle appeared on the slope below her, climbing with his characteristic directness, not looking at the view, looking at where he was placing his feet. He reached her and stood beside her without speaking, looking out over the valley, the way she was looking at it, not with wonder exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read a place rather than merely inhabit it. After a while, he put his hand against the granite flat against the cold face, the way she had her hand against it, and held it there with the patience of someone who understood that the answer would come if you waited for it. "Mama," he said, "why does the rock remember?" She looked at him and the red hair bright in the early light, at the serious face that asked serious questions and expected serious answers, at her father's patience, looking back at her from her son's eyes across 30 years and 1,000 miles of distance. She looked at the valley. She looked at the thin lines of smoke rising straight and clean from the cabins below, the sign of fires burning efficiently, heat moving where it was directed rather than simply escaping upward into an indifferent sky. Because someone was patient enough to ask it to. He nodded the way he nodded when an answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He took his hand off the rock. The granite held its cold for now, waiting for the sun to reach it, waiting to begin the long work of the season. By August, it would be warm enough to press your cheek against and feel the summer stored inside it like a promise kept. They turned and walked back down the slope together, toward the cabin, toward the morning's work, toward whatever the new season was already in the process of becoming. The rock remembered. The winter was over. The work, as always, continued.